All right, this is our third section for Unit 8. We're the first two parts from 1920s. We now go into the 1930s with the Great Depression, although a lot of these things started before 1930 in here. So, in our next section, we're going to start out, we're going to have what I call the alphabet soup quiz. This is where there are 9 different programs that that are representative New Deal programs in our next section, plus FDR, that you need to know what the acronyms stand for. There's a method to my madness for this just memorization, but this will help you there. So when we get to the next section, just knowing what they are off the top of your head will help. All right, for the Great Depression, we're going to have, usually there's like a New Deal question. There's a lot of things about the causes that you have, but there's not as many direct questions. Sometimes some things with the Dust Bowl, the idea of people moving from place to place there that you have, the escapism. So we'll cover a lot of those things, but there aren't as many like concrete type questions when you look at the state standards when it comes to the Depression. The 1930s, we kind of bracket on both ends with the stock market and then Pearl Harbor, and then the 1932 election, which is one of the biggest that we have. All right, Black Tuesday. A lot of people say that's what caused the Great Depression. It is not. We already had farmers that were in the Great Depression. Florida, we were in the Great Depression due to the land bust and boom. But this is where it's kind of symbolically, it'll make things even worse. I always kind of go through and say, all right, why is it that when less than 3% of Americans own stock, that when after it occurred, we will then dramatically have our economy go down? And here's where, that if you think that if you were a millionaire and you lost half of your money in a very short period of time, what are you going to do? You're going to start cutting back expenses. And this is combined with other things that had happened. A lot of businesses had not cut back on their labor in the late 1920s when business had slowed down. So there was an overstock in a lot of their inventory. So they were able to do an overreaction. By the way, Black Tuesday, like if you see the Mr. Betts video, we have Black Thursday that occurred, and it dropped more on Friday, and then it drops even more. So it's not just one day. We have a series of days there that the stock market drops, and it continues to drop after that. So we have this. Be used to do when you see the different graphs. I know on the EOC we've had graphs, not just the stock market, but of all kinds of different things at this time period. One of your state standards is that you are able to read graphs. So read carefully. A lot of times we're using questions to kind of show in here. So there's a TikTok you can go find in there. All right, weather causes, please write. There's no one cause. 1920s, we talked about the farm problems where they had updated a lot of things, and they're in World War I, and then so there was an overproduction while the demand went down from Europe, so they had an oversupply. We will then have a lot of foreclosures, and this is where by the time we get to the middle of the 1920s, the farmers are already entering the Great Depression. Credit problems, both business and individual. People were buying a lot of things on credit. Businesses were buying it on credit there. The installment plans that we talked about in the 1920s, where they would buy something and you buy it, pay $10 down, pay $10 a month for the next 10 months on something. And people had overextended. Buying on margin, people were buying stocks on margin, basically taking a loan to get stocks. Was good as long as the market was going up, but once it went down, those loans were called in. Key word to know with here is speculation. A lot of the problems we have happen because people were speculating that things were going to keep getting more valuable. For Florida, instead of the stock market, it was the land boom that we had in Florida. When that bust in 1926, that's why Florida will be in the Great Depression before the stock market. Some other causes. We have wealth distribution. 1929 was the biggest gap that we have between the very rich and the working class. Also, a lot of the wealth that we have is paper wealth. It's not actually true tangible money that you have. So when it just disappears. This is an international crisis there. We will contribute some to the problems internationally, and then it will make it worse for some of the things we try to do. But it's not just the United States there. But we will continue to do for government policies. One tariff you do need to be familiar with is the Holly Smoot tariff. One of the policies we do early on is we pass this tariff. We will raise our tariff on imported goods. That normally helps your businesses in the country. The problem that we had is when we raised our tariffs, so did the other countries, and at that time that hurt our businesses more than it helped them. So this is where we will then have it where the reactions they have for their tariffs will cut our exports and hurt us even more. Less regulation, usually that helps businesses, but the problem was we had less regulation on things like the banking industry, so they were able to cook the books. Here I show a part from America's Story of Us about how the Bank of the United States it went down, and some of the things that they did that maybe if it was regulated there may not have been as much of a problem. And overall business problems. I just make this very broad, but again, we had overproduced in the late 1920s. Less people were buying it. We had large amounts of inventory. So when everything pops in for the bubble there's then even more of a reaction. The key thing here, there is no one cause. It was not caused by the stock market. It was not caused by any one thing. The stock market crash is just kind of seen as more of a point that things were bad. And here's where you see this question that you have. You won't have an except question on the EOC. By the way, I kind of point out with this picture. This is a famous picture from taken where we're going to have about bread lines and soup kitchens and stuff. And you see here free coffee and donuts for the unemployed. But that picture is actually from Chicago and Al Capone. And this is where I was kind of pointing out about how, yes, Al Capone was with organized crime, but one reason why even his own neighborhood supported him is he helped out in his neighborhoods during the early Great Depression. Where I said you'll need to look at the different things for grasp. Where this question, yes, just reading the crowd, but look and see how the unemployment rate, how dramatically it goes up from 1929 to 1932. It does drop, and then we have a second little recession in there, but it still is high. Bank closings, where this is going to be a major problem. Again, what we saw in America's Story of Us, we will have some of this in our next section. But what will end up happening in the New Deal, where we're going to have the policies of the New Deal, which you can see by the dramatic drop in the amount of banks that closed after the New Deal policies were made, that was at least something that was successful and to try to have that. Business failures, it still will be up for a while, but this is where you see the biggest peak is there for 1932. Yeah. That's actually, Mr. Betts has two good parodies that he does for the 1920s there that you have. All right, what is Hoover going to do? Hoover gets blamed for a whole lot of things. Now, when we look back in history, we say Herbert Hoover did not do enough. But he actually did more for an economic crisis than any president. By far, he did much more than any other president. Problem is, we look back in history, and we see how much FDR did, and we say Hoover didn't do enough. At that time, there were people that had said that he was doing too much there. But again, FDR will do even more, and when you compare them. One of his programs, this is not part of the alphabet soup, but it'll be kind of like example with the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, and he was doing loans to banks and trying to help them. A major problem though that Hoover had is he was trying to keep a balanced budget. So yes, he would have money that went to the Hoover Dam, or the Boulder Dam as it was called at that time, so they would call it Hoover Dam, but you would cut other things. So yeah, you provide jobs somewhere, but then you would cut them on others. Hoover was a businessman, and what he asked is basically for people we can pull ourselves up by our bootstraps, rugged individualism there. And when he went to businesses and asked them to please not lay off your workers, all right, you love America, well don't. Which sounds good with this volunteer cooperation or volunteerism. The problem is as things kept getting worse, businesses had no choice, so they had to lay off workers there. So yes, it sounds good there, but businesses, their number one priority is a profit. They don't want to be losing money. So if it means you have to lay off workers, that's what you have to do. Told you things were being blamed on Hoover. There, if you lived in a shack like a lot of the homeless people did, they were called Hoover shanties. When you have a group of Hoover shanties, that's what was called a Hooverville. People would walk around with their pockets out of their pants there with like little flags, which were called Hoover flags. Again, you were blaming it on Hoover. Was it his fault? No. I mean, there are some things he could have done better, and especially looking back, and maybe he didn't react like he should have in the beginning. But this happens less than 8 months after he becomes president. So yeah, he happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. And I kind of go on to this one thing with leaders, whether it be presidents, whether it be principals, coaches. They get way too much credit when things are good, but also way too much blame when things are bad here. But part of what becomes for a great leader is how do you react to some sort of crisis or emergency that you have. It's easy to be a leader when everything's going good. One thing that definitely was a negative for Hoover, wasn't his fault, but he's going to be the one blamed for it, will be in 1932. They're going to be the bonus army, which are veterans from World War I that were promised in 1945. They are going to get a bonus check for their service in World War I. Well, many of them were out of work. They come outside of Washington, D.C. Hoover has General MacArthur go, and he was supposed to go negotiate with them. Instead, he pushes them out and sets it on fire for the camp they were. Extremely bad public relations for that time. It wasn't Hoover's fault because MacArthur overdoes it, but Hoover is the one that gets blamed for it. I had the question, what did FDR say when he heard about it? FDR, who was in the middle of the race, presidential race and campaign against Hoover, when he heard about this, he said, well, now I've won there. Because, again, people were already blaming it, but it was that much more that was bad for him. And we'll see at the end how this section in there, how much FDR does win this election by. Now, one thing, kind of jumping ahead a little bit there, if we were to look back in history and, again, where Hoover's getting blamed for this, Hoover was a businessman. He's very, very stoic. He's a deep thinker. And so this is where people say we need some more dynamic when things were bad. I know I heard on one of the people that are like one of his biographers and said, what if the roles were reversed? What if FDR, a dynamic person, a glad handler, what if he had been president in 1929 there? And people would have been blaming Roosevelt for things and said, we need someone that's a business person, someone like Herbert Hoover. So again, the president got blamed for it even though he wasn't there. Again, the bonus army is the one that's a vocabulary term that you need to know. And here, Hoovervilles is another one that you have. All right, I showed two different sections from America's Story of Us. We had the Dust Bowl also, where I introduced it when we had the Homestead Act. Coming back to it, it was a man-made environmental catastrophe. The Homestead Act had a lot of people that moved to the Great Plains, and in the late 1880s, 90s, we were an above-average rainfall in that area. So some places that may not have been good for agriculture were successful. Well, several decades later, we go through a prolonged drought. And then we will have, and this is where the American Story of Us has a little diagram showing where the winds blow and these dust storms and how static electricity will pick this up. The book and later on the movie, The Grapes of Wrath, shows where a lot of these people, and a vocabulary word, you know, the Okies, the people that moved from that area there, which was representative of where we will have thousands of people, not just from the Great Plains, but and a vocabulary word you need to know is transient, where today you kind of think of homeless people and they're just going from place to place looking for work. In the Grapes of Wrath, this is where a lot of the Okies will go to California because they hear that there are jobs there. You see the picture up on the top right hand, you're going to see a couple different ones of this lady, and this is where a lot of times there will be pictures showing of these people that are transient people that are on your EOC. Also, maps like this for the Dust Bowl. Where you see the severe damage in the areas of Kansas, Oklahoma. They have the migration route, or again going to California, and people that are looking for work here. What caused it? I use this as an example. There's actually 3 correct answers, but one is by far the best answer that you have on that one. They could relate this with Florida, and here's where some pictures that we have of some of our people that are living in a Hoover shanty and moving from place to place. Some of my migrant workers here in Florida. Here's another example of some of the children that we have there. And so FSA is there will something, or your EOC exam will sometimes show pictures like that, and the idea showing with the Great Depression. All right, I had mentioned this in the class a little bit earlier in the part, but I have it in notes here, where over a quarter of Americans lose their job. Most people end up, even if they didn't lose their job, having their hours cut back or their pay cut. So most people are losing money even if they didn't lose their job. But it was proportionately a lot worse for African Americans. Some areas, well over half the African Americans lost their job. It was also worse for women. I kind of just go in class and say, all right, if we have a married man and a married woman, well, who's going to lose their job first? It's the married woman. They're going to look at the man, you've got to provide family. Woman, you need to go home and take care of your children. Single man, married man, well, the single man's more likely to lose their job. If it's a black man, white man the black man's more likely to lose his job. So again, it was a little bit, it wasn't, you may not think it's fair, but that's again how things would go. For Mexican Americans, where we were begging them to come and work on our farms in World War I, now we're blaming them and kicking them out. But don't worry, a decade later in World War II, we're going to be asking them to come back. Going back to some things we had for the 1920s notes in the late 20s and early 30s, this is where we will have the Rosewood Massacre and the Ocoee Massacre in Florida. In Alabama, you will have the Scottsboro case, and a lot of you that read To Kill a Mockingbird in your freshman year, this is where you probably studied a little bit about it. But it's much like the Rosewood Massacre in Florida, where there was a woman who had accused a black man of raping her. In this case, 8 black men were accused. It was overturned by the Supreme Court, but all 8 of those men spent quite a long time in jail, one of them almost 20 years before everything was resolved. But again, where we have the Black Scare and the rise of the KKK in the 1920s, this continues on in the 1930s also here. Where I do the interviews in the semester, you're going to interview someone that was born before 1960. When I started this many years ago, it was someone born before 1940. And one thing that I found is when they were in the interview, and one of the questions when people would ask, and they talk about the Great Depression, and a lot of times I would hear about, well, things were hard for us, but at least we had food because we didn't live in a city. And you have to realize that 1920 was our first census that we have more urban than rural. So we still have a lot of people that are living on farms or in small towns close to farms there. And I give an example, if you lived here in Inverness, and you would have more likely, you could have your own garden, there are enough farms and all close by, you could go and get food pretty cheap, you could go to Lake Henderson, you could fish for bass, brim, catfish, supply it, you could go hunting, whether it be for rabbits, squirrels, or even bigger game like deer there. So there was ways that you could get food. Meanwhile, if you're living in a city, you didn't have that. All right, you can't go and decide to go squirrel hunting in Central Park in New York City. So 2 of the different types of vocabulary words you need to be familiar with, and you see these pictures of things in here. I already showed you the one from Al Capone of Chicago, but what are called like bread lines and soup kitchen. You think of like for homeless shelters we have today, but this is where there were a lot of things that might be the only meal they got in a day here. This picture that you'll see periodically, I always think it's definitely a little different because you see it's from the Chamber of Commerce, which is usually encouraging people to come, but instead they're saying jobless men keep going. Again, we have in America, we have thousands of people wandering from place to place. When they hear there's a job somewhere they might hear that there's a factory in Ocala that's hiring 10 people, and 2,000 people will show up in the next couple of weeks for that job. You again have to realize we did not have the safety nets that we have today. There is no insurance for unemployment that there is. There is no welfare. There is no food stamps or housing assistance or any of these safety nets that we have today. They did not have that. You lost your job, well then you would turn around and you would have to depend on what you have saved up, and some people, your bank crashed and you lost all the money you had in your bank also. There's a family and charity that you have. Again, a lot of pictures you can kind of see. Here's another one from that series. I always say, just take a look at this lady. I mean, her face, you can tell she's like worried, concerned, but at the same time, I mean, sad, but she's not crying in that way. The children, looks like they're living in some sort of tent that you have, and that's kind of an example of what for the Okies. Here we see a group that is living basically out of a old Model T Ford there. We have 2 children that are selling some tobacco and they're Hoover's Poor Farm, and their hard times are still hoovering over us. Again, the blame it on Hoover idea that you have. One thing I don't spend a long time on but kind of talk about here, first of all, for movies, the 1930s were it's called the golden age of Hollywood, and just to give an example of just one year in there, Two of the what are seen as top 10 movies of all time were made in 1939 with The Wizard of Oz and Gone with the Wind. Mr. Smith Goes to Washington's usually in the top 25 or 50 of all time movies. And again, that's just in 1 year. Walt Disney, this is where he will make his first full length movie that's an animation where he had done cartoons. But the thing about for an escape is, yeah, you think of that time, like here in Inverness, we had not only the Valerie Theater, but there was another theater. And you would go, and in today's money, it would cost like what would be about $7.50 or so to go to a movie. But it's more than just that. So you have some money there. The $7.50 would have for a double feature. That means there's two movies. There would be the main movie, and then there's a B movie that you would have. They would have newsreels. You may not think that's great today, but at that time, instead of something on the radio, you would actually see the video footage and the news of it. You have these cartoons, 5, 15-minute long cartoons that are being played. So realistically, you could go and spend an entire afternoon at the movies. And usually for most places, the cost of those movies, that $7.50, included a popcorn and a drink. So that's where it was kind of used as an escape. You're going to see with literature and comic books and magazines, we're going to have this. Radio in the 1920s was really important there. Most every family had it. Here's where even if you lived in the middle of the Great Plains, you could listen to a live boxing match or news from the other side of the world. We had different shows that were on, radio shows that people listened to. The Lone Ranger was a famous one for kids that we would have. If you've ever seen the movie The Christmas Story, where he's running home and he wants to go listen to Little Orphanette Annie, we're going to have bigger things like Orson Welles' War of the Worlds that we have. I explained in class about how there's a lot that there was people that supposedly, according to newspapers, all these people that panicked and there and thought aliens were actually attacking us. Most of the stories were untrue, but this is where newspapers were losing their coverage and money to radio, so they were trying to criticize the radio. So they basically make up some of the stories that happened in the panic. For soap operas, an opera is very dramatic. The soap operas that are on TV today in the afternoon, they used to be on the radio. The reason why they're called soap operas is the soap side, since it was usually housewives and women's watching it, being advertisers were cleaning products there. So that's where. In the 1930s and also in World War II, FDR is going to be famous for his fireside chats. It was said you could walk down any street in America when he was giving his fireside chat, and you could hear it because every radio was playing it there. So when he would, during every week, he would go and give a radio address, and his wife would go and she would write an article every week, and people are reading what Eleanor Roosevelt has and cheering. And then when World War II comes, in my life, I've never had but one day that it was ever, what's the president saying? And that was at 9/11 when people were, okay, President Bush is going to speak tonight at 8 o'clock. And so everyone went and wanted to listen. But during that time, in the desperation of the Great Depression, those fireside chats were like little pep talks that Roosevelt was giving to us there. For literature, we're going to have two different things. We're going to have both fantasy and realism in here. So for magazines, two magazines that take off and are the biggest in the 1930s, we have Life and the Saturday Evening Post. Now, Life is about life. And this magazine didn't have much for written stories. It was more pictures and showing life in that way. Meanwhile, the Saturday Evening Post, it was kind of very nostalgic. If you go to Cracker Barrel, you'll see things with that. And looking back about how the things were back in the good old days there. This is when we have the emergence of comic books, and you see in the middle there, Action Comic #1. If you have that at your house, here, I'll take it off your hands if you're worried about it. As that's the one that introduced Superman, which today the few of them that are around are worth millions of dollars that you have. You have more of the realism side of it there for a lot of the literature that is written. Richard Wright will have Native Son and other books that will expose the urban ghettos that you have. Some of you might remember Where the Red Fern Grows and things like that you maybe read in middle school. And this is where the entertainment, not just movies, radios, books, magazines, all of this was kind of used as an escape. And this is where a lot of times in the worst times is where art comes around. All right, I don't have a lot in the notes for this because this is where we watch a couple sections of American Story of Us, which they tell a lot about the building of it, but I use this as an example for the works programs, which we're going to find in the New Deal. We're going to have these works programs. Now, there's a double meaning for the works that puts people to work doing public works, and public works are things like bridges, roads, libraries, schools there. And what we did is we will hire these construction workers out of work, use materials, and help things to go. Although Roosevelt will be famous for it, this is where President Hoover will have the Boulder Dam that is built, and it will put a lot of people to work. Also during this time, this is where the little town of Las Vegas will boom, and since it's a giant hydroelectric plant, will help to provide the electricity for Las Vegas that you have. Now, one of the biggest elections in American history is the 1932 election. Hoover, again, the idea of blame it on Hoover. Most people didn't think he was going to win at this time, but still, even in the summer, it looked like it may be close. It wasn't. You see the map for electoral map, you will see a whole lot of blue and not much red there. So not much for a sitting president, and people are blaming it on Hoover. But even the popular vote, in American politics in the past 100 years, anytime you're over 100% or over 50% is actually big for a popular vote. So even though we've had some landslides in the Electoral College, again, it's very seldom that you get over 50% even in the popular vote. Now, the critical election, this is a government term that you need to know here. And 3 times in American history we have had a critical election. 1932 was the last time we did. But what a critical election is not only the president's party changes, but the party that controls the House and the Senate changes. So all 3 change in one election. Again, it happened here. So it's not only just blame it on Hoover, it's blame it on Republicans and their policies for the 20s there, as we will go from Republican to Democrats. In 1860, we had a critical election. We went from Democrats to Republicans with Abraham Lincoln leading the way. The third critical election was in 1800, when we will go from John Adams and the Federalists to President Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans. Now, one thing that happened during this time, we were in the deepest part of the Great Depression, banks going under, businesses going under. Hoover loses this election, FDR wins in November. But at that time, our inauguration was in March. So we have 5 months before the president's going to be inaugurated. President Hoover goes to President-elect Roosevelt, and he will push for him to try to help. I mean, people believed in him. And this is something that where a lot of times we praise President Roosevelt, but shows his selfish side, because even though Hoover was asking for the help, Roosevelt will not there. He wants to make sure that everything is blamed on Hoover and all the credit goes to Roosevelt there. Meanwhile, in that 5 months, the economy will get a lot worse and we'll go deeper into Great Depression. We will add then the 20th Amendment to the Constitution, then that will shorten the lame duck period, that will make it the election in November and then the inauguration in January there. Again, because of what Roosevelt did. Later on, Roosevelt will be also the reason for the 22nd Amendment, as he's our only president to serve more than 2 terms. So later on, we will add the 22nd Amendment. That does limit the president to 2 terms. Before that time, it was an unwritten rule or precedent there, but then it becomes with it. Here in Florida, this kind of summarizing things in it, we were in the Great Depression before the stock market crash. The land boom and bust will go, and by 1926, that speculation of land is gone. We then get hammered by the Miami hurricane in 1926. We will have the Palm Beach hurricane in 1928, which makes things worse. Even in the 2 biggest agricultural industries, the citrus industry is going to have the Mediterranean fruit fly that comes, and it will devastate our citrus crops. In the late 20s and then in the 30s, we are going to have the Texas tick fever that hits our cattle in Florida there. You see that the bank's closing. It's not after 1929, it's 1926 that we will have this. Now, one thing about the massive amount of people that we had leave in the late 1920s from Florida, we had so many people come in the early 20s that whole decade we actually increased the population 50% in one decade. There, and again, that was even with thousands of people that had came and then moved back, but for the amount of people that stayed there.